Hello and welcome to this first Monday seminar. And the theme today is the public diplomacy of Canada and Mexico and what they are doing in this unusual moment of North American public diplomacy. And I'm joined with by two distinguished colleagues from Canada, Evan Potter, who teaches at the University of Ottawa. Evan is a well-known scholar of public diplomacy, somebody who pioneered the study of digital diplomacy, and his current work is on cultural statecraft of Canada. And he is the person who coined the term cultural statecraft, which I find to be a really helpful way of rethinking cultural diplomacy because it brings in a number of areas of cultural policy over and above just cultural programming of governments. Joining us from Mexico is Céssar Villanueva Rivas, who is professor at IberoAmerica and is his most recent book is also a specialist in cultural diplomacy. His most recent book is Sombreros, Frida y Boom, a book on the image of Mexico, which has some I think quite stark revelations about the image of Mexico and the image deficit of Mexico, which we'll be hearing about. So both of our guests will speak for about 10 minutes about their respective countries' situation and plans right now, and then we will go over to questions. And I think both countries have new governments, so are in a very interesting time to hear from our immediate neighbors. So Evan, why don't you go first?
Sure.
And I'll pass it over to you.
Okay. I'll just wait. Okay. Just go. Thank you. So thank you, PDCA, and thank you, Nick, and greetings, César. We haven't met. Look forward to speaking over the next hour and engaging in our Q&A. I have to say that this is I think not to overstate things, crossroads, juncture in global public diplomacy, certainly the public diplomacy of the United States, but I expect also the public diplomacy of Canada and Mexico in relation to what the U.S. will do on PD or will not do. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to make a few observations, and I think perhaps pick up some of the themes in our Q&A. So I'll say something about how we see your American public diplomacy. I'll make a few observations on Canada, which typically speaks softly and carries no stick. I identify what I think is an essential PD dilemma, and then make some comments on where PD could go in the next, 100 days, 200 days, 300 days. Next slide, please. So I think we all agree that America for the past 70 years has had a great success in promoting, I would say, its brand of representative democracy, but really liberal democracy worldwide, due to the universal appeal of liberal democratic values, which is freedom of thought, freedom of religion, freedom of culture. And this has been a major capacity for the United States to exercise its capacity to attract and persuade, so-called its soft power. Now, what's happened, and it's happened very quickly, is that the Trump administration, so Trump 2.0, has, I was going to say apparently, but clearly rejected this proposition, right? And that it does not view America as the shiny city on the hill, or if it does, it certainly won't say so publicly. And so we outside, and I won't speak for César or anybody else outside the United States or inside the United States, but certainly in Canada, and I'm speaking from an Ottawa perspective as a person who is not in the federal Canadian government, but has been around the federal Canadian government and inside it for many, many years. So we are watching what is happening to PD in the United States with great dismay because we're watching within, I think this is probably unprecedented, that the rapidity of the dismantling of PD institutions within the first 100 days. Now, I understand that some of this will undoubtedly go to judicial review. Some of it may go to all the way to the Supreme Court. But the message, it's the message that's being sent to the rest of the world and to America's allies. And the message to the allies, of course, is American retreat from the promotion of liberal internationalism. The message to authoritarian challengers, notably China, is we are not going to defend liberal democracy abroad. And that's very disconcerting from the perspective of America's allies. Finally, again, looking from the Canadian perspective, it's not clear once these institutions, whether it's Voice of America or USAID, which I consider to be part of American public diplomacy and cultural statecraft, whether these institutions can be rebuilt. Once they are taken apart piece by piece within 100 days or 200 days, one assumes that the Trump administration will then have another 2.5 calendar years to consolidate the dismantling. So for us, this is very disconcerting. Next slide, please. Now, just a few, for those who aren't that familiar, perhaps, with Canadian public diplomacy. I would say that Canadian public diplomacy has always relied on Canada's high ranking as a nation brand. Everybody likes Canada. Canada is ranked in world branding surveys as one of the most attractive country brands in the world, if not consistently in the top 3. But just as our record on national defense spending shows, Canada talks a good game on public diplomacy, but vastly underinvest in its public diplomacy relative to what the United States and European countries spend. Now, this has always been a problem because my colleagues within the Canadian federal government have always said, why should we invest in public diplomacy? Look at our country rankings. We don't have to do anything to be liked and respected. And that's always been a kind of conversation ender, if I can call it that. I mean, where do you go from there, trying to convince senior bureaucrats and people in the Prime Minister's office to take public diplomacy more seriously? During the Conservative administration of Prime Minister Stephen Harper between 2006 and 2015, we in the PD community in Canada all references to public diplomacy in official Canadian government documents was replaced with advocacy. And I'll come back to that. And it was particularly trade advocacy. Then, with the arrival of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, we all hoped that there would be a revitalization of Canadian public diplomacy. And indeed, Prime Minister Trudeau, wrote the revitalization of public diplomacy in his mandate letters to his foreign ministers in the first 3 years of his administration, so between 2016 and 2019. And then it just disappeared. PD just faded away. So, public diplomacy has never been seen as integral to Canada's international influence. It's always been tangential to the main game of trade advocacy. Next slide, please. Which leads me to an observation of a current PD dilemma, and I see that in the United States. So we need public diplomacy, so the ability to project our values and influence our soft power more than ever through public diplomacy instruments, culture, international aid, through international global broadcasting. So we need those more than ever to address global challenges. The growing inequality, new security problems associated with AI, climate crisis, the the challenge of China, and to a lesser extent, Russia. Yet the Trump administration, from a non-American perspective, appears to conflate public diplomacy and soft power with a woke agenda. So I had to refamiliarize myself with this notion, this word woke. Why is there so much baggage attached to it? Why is it disparaged so much? Because essentially woke to me initially meant promoting social justice. And what is wrong with promoting social justice? Well, I think it is because it has been rebranded, certainly in the American political sphere, as diversity, and particular sexual diversity. And so this has, I guess, contaminated the notion of public diplomacy as being essential to promote social justice abroad. And if you look at another layer on this dilemma, is the notion of democracy building, because of course, what's happening is that we're conflating PD, soft power, and democracy building. And the Trump administration does not see democracy building as being essential to its international vocation. And it's pointing, of course, to the $2 trillion that were, quote unquote, wasted to bring democracy to Afghanistan. Next slide, please. So what is to be done? The question comes from a Canadian perspective. What are other liberal democracies, such as Canada, the UK, Mexico, to do? Is it our responsibility now to attempt to fill the PD vacuum, the American PD vacuum? And this creates, I think, two problems come to mind. First of all, the combined public diplomacy of, the liberal democratic world, we just don't have the political will and capacity to project the equivalent of American smart power. Second problem that I see is that the Trump administration doesn't appear to accept the proposition that it is in the U.S. national interest to combine hard and soft power because, as the president frequently points out, soft equals weak. So what is a potential solution? Do we need yet another rebranding of public diplomacy to satisfy? And I saw the Taylor Greene, Representative Greene's recent post, or yesterday's X post, her long letter to the White House. And so do we have to rebrand PD to satisfy Representative Greene and her base? How do you harden soft power? Is it advocating freedom and accountability instead of democracy? Is it making America great again by promoting American-style entrepreneurship in countries vulnerable to Chinese influence? In other words, are we back, thinking back to public diplomacy under our previous Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, where Canada had to rebrand public diplomacy and make it advocacy, and notably trade advocacy, for it to be politically palatable. Next slide, please. And so I'll just leave you with the thought from our current new Canadian Prime Minister, who of course has not talked explicitly about PD, but I note the following quotation. And I don't know, he made this remark, I believe, certainly in the last week. He said, Canada has what everyone wants, We're a confident nation that celebrates our diversity. Note the word again, favorite Canadian word, diversity, that believes in and practices free speech, that respects the rule of law, and that has a vibrant democracy. So this kind of lays out, I would think, another go at revitalizing Canadian public diplomacy. Don't know if Prime Minister Carney will include explicit references, as Trudeau did in his mandate letters. I don't even know if he'll make mandate letters public the way the previous Prime Minister did. But it leaves another question. Are such public declarations enough to stop the backsliding of liberal democracy worldwide? So those are my remarks.
Okay, Evan, thanks for setting out your stall. I'm glad now to bring in Céssar Villanueva for the view from Mexico. Céssar, over to you.
Can you hear me fine?
Yes, you're coming through loud and clear.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me here, Nick. Thank you from the Public Diplomacy Council for the invitation. And it's a pleasure to finally meet Ivan Potter, whom I have read a lot of his work throughout my career. So it's an honor to be here today. I endorse a lot of what Evan just mentioned, but I will take a different course of reflection. And I will start by thinking of this metaphor brought by an American diplomat, which I will mention in a moment, which is the bear and the porcupine. And I call it the bear and the porcupine 2.0, resetting Mexico's public diplomacy towards the United States. Next one, please. By the way, today is Cinco de Mayo in Mexico. As you know, it's a celebration for the Battle of Puebla. It's a very special day for us here in Mexico. I invite you to picture North America as the bear and the porcupine, a metaphor coined by Ambassador Jeffrey Davidow that still captures the power imbalance between the United States and Mexico. Today, I will show you how possibly Mexico could upgrade its public diplomacy playbook, turning prickles into persuasive narratives to advance national interest in a far less rule-bound era. Mexico is not a country with a high brand. It has a lot of problems to position itself as a democracy, as a champion of human rights. I wish we would, but certainly Mexico is a country with a lot of problems. Over the 10 minutes, I will trace the shift from a liberal rules-based bargain to a new feudal realist environment. That's what I call it. And try to deconstruct the United States' current public diplomacy posture to examine Mexico's emerging narrative turn, and try to land on 5 concrete action lines that can help Mexico to reclaim agency. Let's begin with the fable itself. In Davidow's telling, bear, large, confident, and often unaware of its own weight, cannot understand why the porcupine bristles at every move. From Mexican perspective, every affectionate paw feels like a potential crushing blow. Conversely, from Washington's perch, every Mexican quill appears hypersensitive, even obstructionist. This mutual incomprehension is not just rhetorical. It shapes border security, trade, and even the daily discourse on migration and fentanyl. By resurrecting this fable, which has probably 22 years when he came out with a book precisely on that, and that the craft of public diplomacy is, above all, the craft of reframing stories so that mutual interests, not mutual irritations, come to the fore. Next one, please. Between 1989 and 2016, we enjoyed, quotes, a liberal bargain. NAFTA deepened supply chains, educational exchanges blossomed, and shared democratic norms gave us common diplomatic language. On this, we signed a contract in the early 90s to try to bring the best of the region along with Canada and try to commit ourselves to democracy and human rights cooperation, among many other things. Next one. First, border securitizations dominates the agenda, walls, drones, and Title 42-style expulsions. Second, the fentanyl crisis collapses China, cartel violence, and U.S. opioid politics into single emotive narrative that sidelines nuance. Third, migration and trade are rhetorically weaponized. We hear talk of Gulf of America, tariffs, as chains framed as zero sum. In this context, the United States now acts less like a liberal hegemon and more like a neo-feudal lord, prioritizing hierarchy, personalized deals, and transactional loyalty over institutional cooperation. Mexico's public diplomacy must therefore speak a new dialect, one attuned to power politics, yet capable of reinserting share gains into the conversation. This idea of a new feudalist realism comes from the incapacity to pin down the idea of a neo-realist or historical realism or classic realism. What really resembles more this realist politics of the United States at the moment is a sort of new feudal system. Next one, please. Deconstructing the bear. What precisely has changed in the US public diplomacy these days? Hierarchy over partnership. Allies are invited to fall in line rather than deliberate. Elite-centered rule, decision-making narrows to a small circle, often bypassing career diplomats and Congress. An aggressive narrative toolkit. Tweets, social media, tariffs, and televised ultimatums blur the line between foreign policy messaging and domestic campaigns. Order skeptic posture, institutions from the World Trade Organization to UNESCO are treated with suspicion, reducing the space for traditional PD collaboration. The implication is stark. The classic two-level game, official negotiation coupled with societal outreach, now tilts towards unilateral storytelling that normalizes pressure as diplomatic routine. If Mexico merely reacts, it will always trail the narrative. Next one, please. Rereading the porcupine. Mexico, in turn, has begun a narrative turn. We have slipped from negotiation to near obedience, quietly adopting US security priorities to save face at home. We lean on a victim as leverage frame, useful for sympathy, but risky if it locks into defensive rhetoric. Our real strength lies in economic indispensability. Nearshoring, critical minerals, and electric vehicle supply chains meant the bear actually needs a porcupine. We're learning to build inside the US coalitions, state governors, Fortune 100 firms, and a 38 million strong Mexican American community that vote, hire, and innovate in the swing states. Finally, trust in traditional State Department channels is waning. So subnational corporate and civil venues are becoming our prime PD stages. Recognizing these trends, allow us to reinvent rather to lament our diplomatic postures. Next one, please. Strategic takeaways. And next one, please. Here are 5 action lines to convert insights into impact. Reclaim agency. Craft shared security prosperity narrative. Same logistics corridors that move fentanyl north can move regulated goods and jobs south. Co-security equals co-prosperity. Number 2, exploit economic indispensability. Drive home the message, made together, sold together. Every EV produced in Michigan relies on Michigan lithium and labor. Every lettuce in California relies on Mexican water stewardship. Number 3, diaspora diplomacy 2.0. Mexican Americans are solitaires in chief. Fund micro grants for community podcasts, STEM labs, and civic engagement drives that surface Mexican success stories in Arizona, Georgia, and Pennsylvania. Number 4, subnational coalitions. A bipartisan border state caucus from California to Tamaulipas can champion pragmatic wins, port modernization, green hydrogen corridors, and shared wildfire response. Motto, fix ports, not walls. Number 5, digital narrative agility. Launch real-time dashboards that debunk myths, migration numbers, drug interdiction data, share trade surplus figures, optimize for TikTok and YouTube Shorts. Remember, facts that scroll outperform PDFs that sleep. Executing these lines will not only change perceptions, but also align them with tangible, mutual beneficial projects. And finally, next slide, the last one. My closing message is the following. The porcupine cannot outmuscle the bear, yet it could out-narrate it, turning each quill into a data-driven, human-centered story that advances joint prosperity. By shifting from reactive victimhood to proactive agenda setting, Mexico can thrive even in an age of new feudal realism. Our task is to tell the story in a way that makes cooperation the most compelling, least costly choice for both, I would say, for the 3 neighbors. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Well, this is very helpful way to start thinking about this. I have a couple of questions to set the ball rolling, and these are questions simultaneously for Céssar and Evan. The first thing to say is that whether we like it or not, 2026 is going to bring a joint US, Canada, Mexico cultural diplomacy event, that is the FIFA World Cup. Do you see this as being, do you think this is going to work? What's being done? I know Mexico's doing some city diplomacy, I think, around it. What's Canada doing? How do we avoid this becoming a disaster for all public diplomacy of 3 countries?
Well, I don't think you don't feel the FIFA event in Canada yet. And certainly we don't, it's not really associated in the public mind with nation branding yet. But I expect in the months leading up to it, I don't know what month is it, summer 2026, I assume, that there'll be more nation branding opportunities. But I think this is more city branding than it is Canada branding.
Céssar?
Yeah, something that should have been a great regional celebration has changed into a doubtful event where at least Mexico is trying to position itself through city diplomacy and tourism. They are now the feeling of FIFA and the feeling of we have to start this is beginning here to grow. There are committees working on this, but they are finding difficulties to negotiate with the partners in the United States. So it's early to say, but it doesn't look good at the moment.
The other thing that I wonder, what do you both feel has helped in your public diplomacy in recent years? Communicating with the US, communicating with the world. If you had to pick one thing, what would you pick as your greatest hit of public diplomacy right now?
Well, I think César raised it in his presentation, Nick. I think he talked about narrative, creating a shared narrative. And as you're on solid ground, I think with any American administration, whether you're Mexico, Canada, UK, Germany, or South Korea, if you're talking about a shared security narrative, in other words, helping to reinforce American interests, or exploit your economic indispensability, which is certainly, I think, what the new Carney government is going to do in Canada vis-a-vis critical minerals.
César?
No, I think we in the past we have been very successful at making this economic commercial narrative where we are integrated in economic terms, and we were supposed to be very strong and complement each other. We became almost indispensable. However, the societal narrative, the cultural narrative, is what was lacking all the way along, where we try to really connect deeper into our daily lives, making ourselves more socially and cultural complementary. I think that is something I never saw.
So one thing that comes out of what you've both said is that part of the shock of Trump is the move to a transactional way of thinking about the world. And I often, Trump reminds me of the kind of person you meet in a bar room late at night who will tell you that everything in the world is self-interest, and that marriage and prostitution are two ends of the same spectrum. And in a way, the way in which allies are being treated right now is as if to say that trade relationships with our closest friends are based on just on mutual interest, that there is no friendship between countries. It's just who gets most, and you want to be the one that's getting the biggest share of the pie to win a friendship. A thing I used to use as a critique of State Department approaches to public diplomacy was to say that there's such an emphasis on winning, and the idea of winning a relationship is actually psychotic. So is there a way for Mexico and for Canada to relate to each other in a different way, to talk about friendship, to have a genuine exchange where being together is more than just mutual trade? Or do you feel that your relationships are bound to walk in lockstep with Trump? Can you be something other than a neo-feudal realist porcupine in dealing with Canada?
Well, I think definitely Mexico and Canada can recognize the mutuality, right? That it is not just interest-based, that there are certain values that can be reinforced. But in our respective relationships with Washington, Nick, I think it is, for the duration of the Trump administration, it's going to be transactional. It's going to be just as you described it. But between ourselves, so Mexico City, Ottawa, yes, of course, the mutuality is there.
César?
I agree with Ivan, and I will add another layer to that. For Mexico, the neoliberal paradigm of doing business in politics, in economics, was good up to a point, because it really brought a new market and opened up opportunities. But also it created a lot of unevenness in internal society. So it was already hard, and we were adapting to the new demands of the neoliberal paradigm of doing politics. But for me, it's hard to understand how this new realist approach to politics and to commerce, economics, has any gains for the United States. Transactionalism will leave a lot of waste behind, things that really were important at the moment to make America great again. And suddenly, on their own, it's probably not going to work the way they intended to. So I find that plan not a very good plan for the goals that Donald Trump is trying to pursue.
So we have some questions from the Q&A. Mike Korth asks about the president's decision overnight to impose 100% tariffs on foreign films shown in the US to protect the American film industry. Do you think that your countries will impose reciprocal tariffs on American films? And do you think that American films are a really important part of American soft power? I mean, for me, part of the interesting thing about Trump's announcement last night was that he was saying this is a national security threat to the United States, films being made in places other than Hollywood. Though I wasn't sure whether he meant that foreign films 100% made outside the country were the problem, or Wicked being made on a soundstage in Pinewood in the UK was the problem. Which is the big threat that's coming for American influence? And maybe we'll learn more about what the president thinks in later weeks. He certainly wants to beat Gavin Newsom over the head with, hasn't he failed to serve the interests of his core constituency? But what did you make of that? And how do you think your countries will respond? César?
Well, it's a strange announcement because already in Mexico, 85% of the market is covered by basically Hollywood films. So the greatest proportion of exhibition in Mexico is American, and they've been lobbying for many years to have that share. So I don't know how it's not going to change. And, a lot of, if there's an industry that is very much into synchronicity with the aspects of film that require both cooperation is film. We have not only directors, actors, technicians that work and cooperate strongly with the Hollywood industry. So it's really disturbing for me to try to make sense of that announcement.
Evan?
Well, I think the president is talking about a long-standing issue in California, of course, called runaway production. That's what we've talked about for 10 years, over 10, 15 years in the entertainment industry. And Canada has been a great beneficiary of such runaway production, obviously. I don't know the specific figures, but I am sure 100,000 Canadians are directly involved in the production of film and television. And most of that production is not production of Canadian film, and it is mostly American film. And so what I interpret that is just like tariffs on cars. He wants to relocate the runaway production from Vancouver, Toronto sound stages back to Hollywood sound stages. Except that the major studios, there's a reason they're in Canada. Low Canadian dollar and tax breaks. So why make a film in Minnesota or Kentucky when you can go to Southern Ontario or Alberta and shave 30% off your production costs?
Right. Well, and Quebec is really good at animation. I mean, there's actually skills there that you couldn't find other places.
So it'll be interesting to see what the Major Motion Picture Association and the industry lobby says about this latest Trump proposition. He says he's going to do this right away, and how is a question.
So I've got a comment from Tony Wayne, Ambassador Wayne. The point is how to make the World Soccer event into a win for all three countries. I do not see the three governments with a plan for collaboration on making the soccer competition into a win for all three. I do think much good work has been done yet to make this happen. This is a potential plus, but much work is still to do. But who's going to do the work? That's the question. Is somebody has to step up and be the provide leadership on that.
Yeah,
Bruce Gregory has a question for Evan.
sure.
Former Liberal Party leader Michael Ignatieff recently commented in The Economist that because it has world-class universities and research institutions, Canada can expect to see US scholars migrating. But he argues a problem for Canada is its firms rarely invest in university-based research, and federal investment in universities is low. Do you
Right.
have thoughts on his assessment of this element of Canada's soft power?
Sure. No, thank you for that question. It's an excellent
It's a
question.
great question.
And of
Yeah.
course, we've seen the migration, and it's been well publicized in the Canadian media of the three professors from Yale migrating to the University of Toronto. But here is I'll toss this out to Bruce. The previous Prime Minister, Jean Chrétien, so in power from 1993 to 2003, created Canada Research Chairs. And one of the impulse for this was to retain talent in Canada. So rather than Canadians going to greener pastures in the United States or abroad, they were going to stay at Canadian universities. And I think a lot of people have been thinking now, Nick and Bruce and others, that it is time for Canada to do a Canada Research Chair version to attract American academics to come in a formal program rather than just the University of Toronto recruiting star academics from the Ivy League. So I think that is definitely something that the Canadian government now, for people to know, education is a provincial responsibility, though much of the funding for academic research comes from the federal government. So here would be a classic case where if the provinces and the federal government could get together and jointly produce a Canada Research Chair program directed at the United States. That would
But
be
it looks
a
like
positive
Canada is
step.
going to be preempted by the European Union, where Ursula von der Leyen has made a dramatic speech calling for Americans to migrate to Europe.
Well, this sadly, Nick, this is typical of Canada. We're slow off the mark.
It's slow off the mark, yeah.
I mean, when it's staring you in the face, and you could do it if you had the will, but it just never seems to happen in time.
So an anonymous comment, I found the novel way the Canadians are rewording the term public diplomacy towards a concept that more directly advances the national interest. Can you elaborate on this more?
Is this
This
referring
is
to
a comment.
advocacy? Well,
Yeah,
okay.
so
So I can say that during a previous conservative administration, so Stephen Harper, 2006 to 2015, the federal government, the Harper government did rebrand public diplomacy to trade advocacy. That was clearly what they intended to do. But this relates to César's comment about the shared narrative. What is the narrative? I mean, if I'm a country seeking to influence the United States, like any advocacy program, I'm going to research on what my target market wants and what are its aspirations, what are its interests. And then I'm going to try to facilitate the advancement of those interests in a way that my national interests are also advanced. So to talk about minerals, critical minerals to an American audience will resonate. To talk about shared security will resonate. So I think,
well, this is where I'm going with it, is to think
yeah,
about shared reputational security
yes,
and the extent to which we help each other's reputation, and that is part of security. And I thought that Trump's remarks about Hollywood were actually going in a direction that was open to a reputational dimension of security,
Right.
and understanding that something's lost if you don't get to tell your story, especially if the stories are being told by other people who are hostile to you. The problem isn't films being made in Mexico and Canada, it's films being made in places where they have a very different agenda
Right.
politically. Queen of Bergen says she served as a US cultural ambassador and recently experienced that a number of cultural diplomacy opportunities have fallen through. With the current climate, it's starting to feel less optimistic. I'm reaching out to ask, based on your experience, if there are any organizations, platforms, or international spaces outside of government where artists and cultural workers can continue to show up as cultural diplomats or facilitators of exchange. I'm eager to keep doing this cultural work, even if the path looks different. So, where do cultural diplomats go when the US pulls out, or as the US pulls out of cultural diplomacy? Cesar, do you want to lead off with that one?
Yes, I just want to comment on one of the comments that you made earlier, or a comment by Ambassador Wayne, if I understood right. I think the FIFA World Cup 2026 will have to be led by mainly companies. I think companies will have to take the lead and make sure that the companies in the three states, in Canada, Mexico, and US, understand the importance of this and the importance to make money for them. Because I don't see this as taking off from governments themselves, and I see a lot of problems with the sports diplomacy per se. So I hope companies unlock, hopefully also organized groups in society, which leads me to the second question. Are there organizations in culture in the States? I think the diaspora in the United States, the Mexican diaspora, is extremely strong. And I know the Canadian is too. But we have around 35, 38 million first, second, and third generation Mexicans there. And I think a good way to mobilize culture is to try to reach out to them. Likewise, there are 1.5 Americans living in Mexico. Mexico is the largest, has the largest amount of Americans living abroad. So I think there are chances there to work, and there are organizations already working on specific agendas to promote culture. I know for food events, for cinema events, for crafts, there are channels through which towns and communities are continue to work together in the cultural sector. So that's something to keep in mind.
Evan, you want to jump on that?
Sure. I think this is a space where, and Cesar has described it with the diaspora communities. Now, the Canadian diaspora community is not as active in the United States as the Mexican diaspora community. But I would say two things. This is an example, what Cesar is describing is an example of bottom-up organic public diplomacy by non-governmental organizations. So at that level, I think we're going to see if it could be mobilized. And it doesn't have to be mobilized by government. It could be mobilized by philanthropic organizations. And I think,
or cities. I think we
or
could do a lot
cities.
with
So
cities.
you don't have, I think, going automatically assuming that public diplomacy can only happen through national, taxpayer funded, foreign ministries, cultural ministries. I mean, certainly they can be catalysts, but I think part of the change in our understanding of public diplomacy is the notion of organic bubbling up, so bottom up public diplomacy.
Right.
I'll also point out that the Germans have historically, as we know, with their Stiftungen, so these are charitable foundations, but publicly funded. So the Germans have publicly funded, I mean, seriously publicly funded organizations all over the world, and they are engaged in public diplomacy, even though they are not being directed by the German Foreign Ministry. So I think that that is important. And just an observation, for many decades, the Ford Foundation was a major funder of Canadian academic research, which people sometimes forget. So American public diplomacy also functions in odd ways, odd and beneficial ways for other countries.
And we also, with one of the quirks of Canada, is that there is a Canadian Fulbright, Canadian
Yes,
US Fulbright Foundation, but that's 100% funded by Canada. So
that's right.
the US is not capable of shutting down the Canada US Fulbright program
Not well.
because it's not funded by them.
Not only is it not capable of shutting it down, but the Canada-U.S. Fulbright is so politically sensitive that even Stephen Harper, when he was prime minister, would never have touched the Canada-U.S. Fulbright program.
Fantastic. Well, fantastic from
Nick,
my point of view.
let me add something to that. Mexico has the Fulbright Garcia Robles Scholarship. It's not just Fulbright Scholarship. It has also the name of the Peace Nobel Prize Mexican diplomat Garcia Robles. And so it's Fulbright Garcia Robles, and it's also very sensitive to that. So I think that's another layer. We have connections at that level of cooperation in education and university exchange, which is very, very important.
So I have a little controversial question here from an anonymous attendee. Is there any recognition in Canada and Mexico that some Americans may have fair concerns about cross-border trade and security? Setting aside the rude behavior, is there any substance to the concerns?
Oh yeah, absolutely. This is what makes public diplomacy narrative building so challenging. Nobody would argue the central contention or critique that Trump has made in both his administrations, that Canada underfunds its military. It's an embarrassment. We Canadians are embarrassed at the lack of funding for our military. We are embarrassed that we cannot protect the sovereignty of our territory. We're embarrassed that, you know what, we don't have nuclear submarines. We can't patrol the Arctic waters the way our adversaries or even our friends can. This is embarrassing. So when we get critiqued by President Trump, and he wasn't the only one, all American administrations, he's just the loudest, he's just the roughest, right? So we're not offended. We're offended by the tone. We're not offended by the substance. And regarding the largest undefended border in the world, which used to be a great thing, now it's apparently a real vulnerability. So we're a little confused on that, because fentanyl exports from Canada to the United States is, again, not a major issue, but Mr. Trump has used it, has politicized it for his own purposes.
And Céssar?
No, it's a very good observation. And I think we in Mexico should have done more in relation to democracy building, human rights building, bringing up middle class to a higher level. I mean, it's embarrassing not to have a country with that capacity to level up to the United States or Canada. However, there was a certain common understanding between Mexico and US, that there would be some reciprocity to try to reach out to those goals. I think there was, for more than 30 years, a message that without being the responsible for those things, United States would support the efforts of Mexico to climb up and to be a much better nation. But this sudden change of route that we witnessed a few months ago has left Mexico in isolation completely, and has to redefine the goals that the agreements that we had in relation to that common prosperity. So, but we have to do more certainly on many issues. And I have a quick question because time is running to Ivan Potter, just a question that brings my part of my presentation. If you agree, Ivan, that Mexico is a porcupine and the United States is the bear, what would be a good figure for Canada? What would be a good animal for Canada to be
I
in
was
that
thinking
male
about that, but
jungle?
you went there.
You went there.
What?
You want to look at the beaver. And
Okay.
so the metaphor of the bit, well, people outside of Canada, and this dates me a little bit. Certainly my students wouldn't understand the idea of the busy beaver, but the beaver is a very industrious animal.
Mhm.
Okay.
It's a very communitarian oriented animal. And so it is a good symbol for Canada, a
Mhm.
busy,
We also say
there's a,
eager beaver, like
well, sorry, there's the eager beaver, but
but
also maybe it's only a Canadian idiomatic expression, busy as a beaver. And so, so I think we need to get a little bit more busy.
So I have a question from Josh Shen, who's my teaching partner and visiting diplomat in residence here at USC. Cesar mentioned that the new US foreign policy paradigm has elites circumventing PD professionals and diplomats. Thinking self-critically, in what ways do you think specifically US diplomats have not performed effectively in relation to foreign countries that has led to a lack of trust among significant numbers of American public and leaders? Is it just lack of explaining more clearly how their work directly benefits American citizens, or are there other points of failure? So do you think that American diplomats did something wrong? And that'll be
Oh,
the last question, I'm afraid.
it's a very clever question that I will not have time to respond in full. But what I would say is that there were clearly, especially when it comes to international organizations, commitments from and experience from high top American diplomats who now are being forced into adopting postures that do not go in line with the idea of being part of an international community. I know particularly the case of UNESCO, and the case of UNESCO is very exemplar because it shows the state of emotion of the United States in relation to issues like culture. And now, as in the new recent um, things that were said, maybe the United States will be leaving again UNESCO after having rejoined earlier. That's clearly a mistake. A professional diplomat would not recommend that particular venue of action because the benefits for participation in culture for the United States at UNESCO are much greater than being absent. We could discuss that, but it's what I have to say in the few minutes that I have.
Evan?
No, I would say that yes. So I don't think there should be a lot of self-blame going around the U.S. diplomatic community. They've been doing their job, going back to what is their job centrally in public diplomacy and cultural statecraft. It is to promote mutuality, and they can't do anything when the Marjorie Taylor Greens of the world do not recognize the benefit of that, or where the president does not recognize, or even their own boss, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, does not recognize that.
Well, thank you so much for a wonderful, wonderful hour of discussion, which completely bears out the value of hearing from our neighbor's perspective at this strange moment. Cesar, Evan, thank you. I know what, so I'll applaud, but Cynthia wants to join to talk about what's coming up next for the Public Diplomacy Council of America. Cynthia?
Thank you very much. And I also want to join in thanking Evan and Céssar. I will be thinking about cultural statecraft and how PD needs to move from reactive victimhood to proactive agenda setting. And of course, Nick, thank you very much for your brilliant context setting and your very sensitive moderation. Thank you. I have to do, before I get into talking about the program, and all of you should be putting June 2 at noon onto your schedules. But before I do, I should talk about a conflict of interest I might have, because my graduate education was paid by Canada's PD. I had a Donner Fellowship from Duke University, and then I taught ethnic forces in modern Canadian literature at the University of Vermont, depending also on that money. When I joined the State Department, the security clearance representative asked me, "Have you received money from a foreign government?" And of course, I had to say, I had indeed. And he said, "Which government?" And I said, "Canada." And he says, "Oh, that doesn't count." And I was very upset as a Canadian scholar. And I said, "Of course it counts. Who knows what they might ask me to do?" At any rate, let me go on and say that on June 2 at noon, we will have a program where we get to talk a little bit about the program that is coming up, the awards that we have given out, one to the North Star team, who's working on artificial intelligence in the department, and one to the U.S.-Saudi Higher Education Partnership Forum team. And that will give us a chance to talk about PD in two very interesting contexts, the artificial intelligence and also Saudi Arabia. So thank you very much, Nick.